a power base of people whose daily interests were tied to him, so that when he goes, they lose all these privileges.
Sanctions have sustained Saddam Hussein in power, and there are many of us worldwide who believe that is also a policy of the United States. Because of the Saddam Hussein threat, quote unquote, the Americans have sold arms on a massive scale to the Arab states, the Gulf, Israel of course, Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
After the Gulf War, U.S. arms manufacturers and the Pentagon took advantage of making new arms sales to the Middle East at the rate of about $1 billion a month.
The oil-producing countries in 1990 had hundreds of billions of dollars in reserve. Now they have maybe hundreds of billions in debt.
But Saddam also serves a more direct goal for the Pentagon.
The United States had to have a justification to remain in the area. It intended to maintain major military forces that could protect and control the natural resources of the region. It wasn't particularly welcome. The people of Saudi Arabia didn't really want U.S. troops on their soil. So Saddam was chosen to remain the devil that would justify the presence of the American angels in this region.
After the Gulf War, the buildup at places like King Khalid Military City, which was supposed to be temporary, has become sort of a bridge for a possible long-term U.S. military base in Saudi Arabia and in the Middle East. There's now thousands of U.S. troops regularly in Saudi Arabia. So at least on a de facto basis, Saudi Arabia has become a military base for U.S. forces in the Middle East. Unless there's a change of regime, that base could well end up being permanent.
Proclaimed as a sweeping victory by almost all Western media, the Gulf War and the subsequent crisis with Iraq have indeed amounted to a superior victory for Washington. Paramount arms sales at a level never seen before, at last huge permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia, resulting in a better control of the oil flow and a better leverage on its pricing. The great losers, on the other hand, are the Iraqi population, still under a Stalin-like dictatorship and slowly dying from starvation. But the losers, however, are not just distant populations of the Middle East. Some of the victims of the Gulf War have also turned out to be right amongst the presumable victors of the war.
In 1991, most Americans were very happy that the Gulf War apparently had ended. It was a quick, decisive victory, and hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops were returning home to parades. What happened a few months later was that thousands of veterans started to report medical problems, such as achy joints, memory problems. They kept falling ill, they were getting rashes, and there was no explanation.
Concerning the use of the type of weapons used by the Allies in the Gulf War, the first warning came from soldiers themselves, whether in Britain or in the US, when they started complaining of symptoms, and that was related to the Gulf War and to the use of the weapons. So it's obvious that it took so long until people took it seriously, because there was this conspiracy of silence.
The first response of the United States military and the United States government was to ignore it, to deny that there was any problem with the health status of American Gulf War veterans.
You had to keep the image of the good guys, namely the Allied, and the bad guy, who is Saddam. It's Saddam Hussein who would use chemical weapons and who would harm his own population and the world with this type of weapons. And it didn't look very nice to show that the Allies have been themselves using weapons that were harmful.
In the 1970s through the 1980s, the Pentagon, in complete secrecy, started experimenting with a new type of high-perforation shell made of the heaviest, hardest, most plentiful metal around, readily available without mining costs or efforts. A metal that just happened to be sitting there in the hands of the US Department of Energy. Uranium waste.
The U.S. Department of Energy and other nations that are involved in the enrichment have tremendous amounts of this waste left over, and they needed to find a use for it.
Depleted uranium rounds reached combat for the first time during the Gulf War. These rounds pierce anything known to this day, penetrating the thickest armor plates like butter. The downside: they are radioactive, contain traces of plutonium, the most toxic metal on Earth, and their debris remain radioactive for about 4.5 billion years.
Depleted uranium is a very hazardous toxic waste. For example, depleted uranium settles in the bone, it settles in the lungs, it settles in the liver, in the kidney, and also in the muscle and testicles. This is an experiment upon rats. Depleted uranium also crosses from a mother through the placenta to a fetus. All this information is widely available. However, the Pentagon, in their overwhelming desire, their passion to use depleted uranium weapons, is trying to suppress this medical research about its high toxicity.
I could go through the early reports on this issue. You know, this is one from July 1990, where they say the most exposed individuals and soldiers who go onto a battlefield after DU rounds are shot, saying that civilians and soldiers may suffer health effects from inhalation and ingestion of DU dust, and even saying that once people realize the health and environmental effects of this weapon, there may be a move to ban it. And this was July 1990. This is just 6 months or so before the war. So you have to wonder why no warnings were ever disseminated to any ground forces prior to the war, even just to say, stay away from the vehicles that have been hit. Don't go climbing on the equipment.